years that I've spent training people to use new systems and new applications and new tools, it's like all of that goes away if you move beyond the user interface that we've all become accustomed to over the last 30 plus years, and just give people a way to speak, type, text, whatever, in whatever medium they choose, and everything else gets cared for behind the scenes. So the vision is, it's ambitious, it's big, but when you start to see breakthroughs like ChatGPT and you see the level of engagement and adoption happen virtually overnight, it gives you hope that this thing that we're all working toward is achievable. It's real. It's more about how do we manage the transition in my mind, right?
Yeah.
It's not about managing the disruption. You can't control that. It's about managing the transition around it. So, I like this idea of organizations having a longer term view of what our workforce will look like 3, 4 years, 5 years from now, and actually being thoughtful about how do you get there. I'm going to create a hypothesis and I'm going to test that hypothesis. And if you test the hypothesis and it turns out to not be true, a good scientist or researcher doesn't just quit there. They go, well, maybe my hypothesis was wrong, or maybe I tested it the wrong way. But you don't, the journey doesn't end there. You change your hypothesis and you test again.
Welcome back to Invisible Machines. I am your host, Josh Tyson, co-author of Age of Invisible Machines. Today, Rob and I are going to talk with one of our friends in the enterprise AI space, Greg Vert, who is a principal at Deloitte and has led many digital transformation initiatives in human resources specifically. We cover a lot of ground in this episode. Greg has spent many years working with enterprise clients on digital transformations, and we talk a lot about the things businesses and business leaders need to be doing now in order to kind of prepare for uncertain and easily disrupted future. We also spend a fair amount of time discussing the ways that AI might change the experience of individual workers inside of these large organizations. There's really something for everyone in this episode, so I'm going to stop talking and we'll get to this conversation now. All right. Well, welcome, Greg. It's great to see you.
Thank
Rob,
you.
A pleasure as always.
Hey.
So OneReach AI and Deloitte have collaborated on HR-related projects in the past, and so Greg, you're familiar with the OneReach platform and the ideas of hyperautomation that we talk about in Age of Invisible Machines. So I'll just go right ahead and jump in with kind of the question du jour. How are you seeing ChatGPT alter the conversations you're having about conversational AI and also in the HR space?
Yeah. Well, first of all, kudos to the OpenAI team and putting something out to the mass public that makes AI feel real. I think we haven't seen a moment like this that's gotten as much public attention since maybe IBM Watson competed on Jeopardy, right? And it's a great way to showcase the leaps and bounds and evolutions that we've seen, especially in the generative space, in terms of what's possible. And so I think it's opened up a lot of conversations with our clients, our HR clients, around how could I use this within my organization to make the workforce experience better, easier, to make people more productive, less distracted, by making some of the things that they have to deal with every day, writing emails, creating content a little bit easier. So it's opened up a lot of interesting conversations. The funny thing to me about it is, the underlying technology has been around for a little while, and I know OneReach AI has been using it, and a number of others, Microsoft. And so, in our consumer lives, we probably were unaware that this was starting to be incorporated into different experiences that we were having, interactions we were having. It wasn't until they opened up this simple app and gave people the ability to go in and play with it and play with it for free that I think the conversation really got started. And I was just reading an article yesterday that ChatGPT has reached 100 million unique users already since it launched at the end of last year, which makes it the fastest to reach that number of any internet app. So it beat TikTok, it beat Instagram, which I think is just remarkable. It shows that people are really interested in this topic. They want to engage with it. And now, for us, the next step is to say, well, okay, well, how do we take this and use it
Sure.
in more meaningful ways, in ways that actually make the world a better place? So I'm
So does
excited to
it
be part
mean
of that
that they
journey.
want to talk to machines? People want to talk to machines more than they want to talk to each other? Is that what just happened?
Maybe we may look back on this as a watershed moment in human and machine collaboration. We'll see.
Finally, something that agrees with everything I say.
Yeah, we just needed the breakthrough, right? It's all about the breakthrough.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, and it makes me look smarter when I'm writing emails.
Mhm.
I think I saw that
Please compliment
ChatGPT
me
is
on my email.
releasing. Yeah. Is it? I think ChatGPT has also now announced that they're releasing like a subscription version that's got a few more capabilities, and that there always will be this free version, but that now I think
Yeah,
it's being rolled out as like a legitimate productivity tool.
Yeah.
yeah. I saw
Um,
that they were going to integrate it with Teams, or may have already done that.
I saw that. Yeah.
Which will be interesting to see how quickly people adopt that. It can automatically capture notes from a meeting that takes place in Teams, which is interesting. We'll see how much people are comfortable relying on that versus giving up the control of capturing notes on their own. But you mentioned something, Josh, that I thought was really interesting. I was talking to somebody a couple weeks ago, and he said that he puts every single email he writes now through ChatGPT to see if it can make it more effective and more direct. And I haven't been doing that, but I think it's a really interesting practical use case that a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
Rob and I have talked a lot about. Oh yeah, go ahead, Rob.
Yep. I was probably just hitting on the same thing you were about to. We
Well,
do
yeah, what I
talk
was
a
going to
lot.
talk about is we do. You've mentioned the idea that right now you might soon we'll see ChatGPT like we're seeing in Teams. You might see it as an add-on in Word or in your email client, but that ultimately, like the real next phase is we don't need an email client. We don't need Word. We just have a chat interface that can take what we're saying and put it in the right place and use it in the right way.
Yeah. We have this, kind of internal demo that we use to kind of unlock this idea, which is, let Comcast know that my internet's down.
Hmm.
You know, do I need to know how? Like email, SMS, smoke signals. Like, do I really care? I just care that they know and that they respond back to me.
Right.
So I think that, our kids will be like, what's email?
Yeah.
Like,
I hope so.
and why should
For
I
our
ever,
sake.
why did you care about it?
Yeah.
Why did you need to know how, what protocol you were going to use to communicate with somebody? Like, um, seems, seems, seems like a lot of extra cognitive load on communication. What app did you respond to me in? Like,
Who
why did this
cares?
exist? Yeah.
Yeah.
Why do we need to care about this? Uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, it's one of the reasons why I was so interested in OneReach AI a couple of years ago when we first started collaborating. It was this vision that the most frictionless user experience we can create is through natural language, and
Uh-huh.
that like hit me like a ton of bricks. And I'm like, well, yeah, obviously, right? Like the years that I've spent training people to use new systems and new applications and new tools, it's like all of that goes away if you move beyond the user interface that we've all become accustomed to over the last 30 plus years, and just give people a way to speak, type, text, whatever, in whatever medium they choose, and everything else gets cared for behind the scenes. So the vision is, it's ambitious, it's big, but when you start to see breakthroughs like ChatGPT, and you see the level of engagement and adoption happen virtually overnight, it gives you hope that this thing that we're all working toward is achievable. It's real, and we're making big strides.
Yeah.
It's exciting.
Yeah. It's also scary. I think, there's a lot of disruption coming, and I think we've talked about that in the book quite a bit.
Hmm.
And I think most people see it as hyperbole, to be honest. um, uh, but but I wonder, like, now that clearly ChatGPT has scared the pants off of Google, right? Like, they're bringing back their founders. They're like, oh crap, we're not risk takers enough. right?
Yeah.
And we got to bring back the risk takers, the people who will take chances and innovate. It just, when do you think the kind of the cascade effect will happen where people realize, wait a sec, a year ago we would have thought Google search had no chance of being disrupted, like 10 years away, like impossible, right? And now everyone's going, oh my God, Google's bringing back their founders. How soon do they think, oh, maybe we're next? If it can happen to Google, it can happen to anyone. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's interesting, right? It kind of puts them on defense for the first time in a while, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they've got to worry about protecting what they built. I'm going to actually bring it down to an individual level, right? Because you started that, Rob, talking about people uh, thinking of it as hyperbole, right? This disruption and this
Yeah,
risk that we see on the horizon. And I see this all the time with organizations that we work with, right? Where, when you go in and start to talk about automation, some people will go, oh, well, I'm not worried about that. That doesn't affect me. I do X, Y, Z. You can't automate this, right? And then, the technology evolves and it starts to get closer and closer to what it is you do. And now all of a sudden, that fear starts to set in, and it's like, well, okay, wait a second, but the technology can't do it as well as me, or it can't do it as with as much institutional knowledge or sophistication, or it can't bring as much experience as I have to the table. Like, people rationalize this in different ways. It's probably a really interesting psychological study. Um, and then it's too late, right? It's like, all that time that you spent sort of justifying why you were better at position to do whatever it is the machines are now capable of doing. You could have been looking instead to say, how do I fit into the new world, right? Like, machines aren't going to take over everything, right? We're not talking about a dystopian future here.
right.
We're talking about a world where machines can do all the stuff that we probably would rather not be doing if we had our way about it. And we can focus on things that are, actually interesting and important and impactful and make the world a better place. And it's kind of that bigger picture view. So when you take that and you look at it for, Google's position and what's happening kind of at the industry level, it's sort of the same thing. It's like, all right, so this big innovation happened over here. How do we make sure, we could spend all the time that we want sort of justifying why what we have still makes sense in this world, or you can figure out, how do I work in the world where this massive disruption just happened, and we still offer something, or we can offer something new that maybe doesn't exist yet, that complements it, and it brings us into a whole new level. So
Yeah. Let me hit you with kind of because I think you're right. It's, getting down to the individual. That's really where it's at. I mean, that's what we're all talking about. It's collective thinking. So let's think of it as an individual experience with it. And that's going to bubble up to an overall voice. Um, I think it's clear that industrial revolution, etc., has caused many of us to kind of value or identify ourselves alongside our productivity. So we measure our
yep.
productivity as human beings, and until our deathbed, apparently, and then we decided it didn't matter, and it was our
Yep.
relationship, but it's too late. Um,
Yep.
and uh, I think that that this makes especially for certain generations of folks, cause a seismic shift in how they identify themselves within work, how they value themselves, how they define themselves, how the orgs, or should orgs deal with it? How do they think about
Yeah.
the psychological effect of those folks who are like, wait, I could pump out, whatever, 1,000 words a minute. I don't know what's good. What's good? Is that good, Josh?
I don't know either anymore. Yeah.
What's good?
That's
Pipe in
pretty good.
class, right?
It's a Mavis Beacon. Yeah.
That's pretty good. So, yeah, and now who am I if a machine pumping out 10 times that, um, who am I, and how do I, reevaluate and kind of create a new dashboard for who I am and how I'm valued?
Yeah, we didn't even talk about the fact that ChatGPT can write and code, right?
Right,
So all the
right,
people that were on the other side of the fence thinking I'm safe because I'm
right.
building these things. Now, now it's like, okay, what?
Yeah, 1,000 lines of
But
code. Oh,
yeah,
didn't see
yeah,
that coming.
nope, nope. I mean, it goes back to what we were talking about, right? Like no one is really safe from disruption, right? Like we should all be aware of it and tracking it and sort of figuring out what shifts do we need to make. And I don't know if there's a lot of organizations out there that are thinking that far ahead, right? And there's one other issue that I would say, you kind of talked about productivity and breaking that mold, but we also have this problem with short-term incentives and short-term
Uh,
tracking where it's like everybody's so worried about hitting the next quarter or having a
uh,
good fiscal year, and we get stuck in the cycle because we're not looking that far ahead. And I think that's where organizations need to shift, right? They need to really be thinking 3 years from now, especially with the uh, radical innovations in the technology space like ChatGPT that are going to come in and significantly change the composition of my workforce, right? And I'm going to have a lot more human and machine collaboration. Traditional jobs are going to go away or get disrupted. New jobs will emerge. You think about things like AI ethics officers and people that are monitoring machines at a level to ensure that we're not creating unintended consequences. There's a whole new category of jobs that'll come out of this, right? Just like
right.
any other massive revolution. So it's more about how do we manage the transition in my mind, right?
Yeah,
It's not about managing the disruption. You can't control that. It's about managing the transition around it. So, I like this idea of organizations having a longer term view of what our workforce will look like 3, 4 years, 5 years from now, and actually being thoughtful about how do you get there, right?
right.
Not just dealing with because the conversations we're having right now are all short-term reactions to economic cycles. It's how do I take out cost? How do I improve workforce productivity? And these bigger, longer-term questions are getting ignored from my experience. So
Yeah, yeah. I was uh, Unilever, like a huge company, 170,000 employees, thinking about, by 2025, uh, having every employee have an IDW, intelligent digital worker, that
mhm.
helps them get their work done. Um, it's not, from what I understand, it's not being thought about at the highest levels though. These are just, champions of change within the org that
Right.
have this idea, right? And they're trying to sell it. And like, I think I've heard this a lot where right now for a lot of organizations, the challenge seems to be like high level management just not being wired to buy into this. Again, like Google, right?
Yeah.
Like just in the wealth preservation mode, how do I reduce risk? How do I secure this asset and take very little risk? Um, yeah. So so now you have like this blocking happening at the highest level, or maybe it's not blocking, maybe it's just the absence of enthusiasm, and the willingness
Or
to
understanding. I
right,
mean, it could
right.
could could start there. More fundamentally, they don't understand what's happening.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. How
Well,
how
and it's
did they
tricky
shift
too
that?
because oh, well, it's like as we talk about in the book. I mean, I think what makes it extra challenging is that the first step is almost literally falling on your face. Like you have to you have to
Yeah,
try something and
right.
fail at it. If
yeah.
you're smart, you're doing it internally and you're working, with employees to try and refine conversational experiences before you roll them out to your customer base. But I mean, the first step is to blow it. But to
Right.
win, you blow it, then you
Yeah, it's
quickly
kind of like
Yep.
recover
running
and you
into
build
a
on mistakes.
yeah, it's like running into a locked door. You got to just put your weight into it, and either you're gonna go through or you're gonna bounce off.
Yeah. The only way, one way to find out,
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's interesting. I think about that an analogy, and and I think it's actually starting to happen, that shift where over the last 2 or 3 years, I probably have had 200 conversations with different clients, different HR leaders about the potential of conversational AI. And I'll call that the curiosity phase, right?
Okay.
Everybody wanted to know about it. It was high profile enough that you couldn't ignore it, but it hadn't quite broken through to that. Okay, we need to do something, right? The call to action, or maybe the call to investment, right? But I think we're starting to move into this next phase of experimentation, which is the running into the locked door
Okay.
moment, right? Where
Hard to keep your composure as a serious executive after you're like
yeah,
stumbling to
right.
get up off the ground.
Yeah. Well, and the funny thing to me is that we're seeing higher rates of adoption on the customer facing side for businesses. And I'm like, why wouldn't you run into the locked door with your
I totally agree.
workforce first and
Yeah.
then take it out to your customers?
Yeah, practice
Yeah.
on the folks that are, open to it. That,
Right.
I totally agree. It's like, yeah, it's like doing our clinical trials on our babies, like.
Yeah. That's a good one. Yeah, it's exactly like doing clinical trials on our babies. And it's like, take advantage of the experimentation you have with your workforce, because you're going to get better feedback, richer feedback, right? Like as consumers, how often do we get that survey at the end of an interaction and just ignore it, right? We've been over surveyed. But I can tell you as an employee, if I have a negative experience, someone's going to hear about it, right? Like I'm going to take the
Yeah.
extra 2 minutes to fill out the survey. So I think you're going to get better feedback, and it'll help you to get through that locked door faster. And by the time you go out to your customers, you've got a better capability around what this is, how to use it in the right ways, how to put the right guardrails up, the right monitoring and governance in place. And obviously we don't want to impact our customers in any negative way. That gets to the heart of the business. We also don't want to impact our workforce in any negative way, but there's ways I think to kind of experiment internally without controlling the blast radius or creating too much disruption.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a big difference between a customer choosing not to buy from you and an employee quitting over an experience. Like they're less likely to quit over it.
Yeah.
And more likely that they'll, having used it, now be able to imagine ways they can do their jobs better. So
Right.
I think people see it as a throwaway, not understanding there's a ton of value that can be captured in doing it in that way. You're gonna see, the effects of it on top line and bottom line doing it internally. It's not just a, throwaway experiment.
Right. It's not experimenting for experimenting's sake. It's you can create value along the way as well. And it's interesting to me. One other kind of thing that jumped to my mind is, because we're rolling it out more on the customer facing side and we're experiencing conversational AI more in our consumer lives right now, it's actually creating an expectation that most organizations maybe don't see coming, which is, if it's easier for me to do something transactional in my personal life because I have an assistant, I'm now going to start to want that, or maybe even expect that in the workplace as well, right? Like if I need to process an expense or take some time off, or all these like kind of mundane transactional things that are important to running a business, but nobody wants to have to deal with or carve time out to do. They're going to want that assistant. And I think most organizations, we saw this shift with self-service, right? Where people realized that they could get their banking done online, right? It's the classic example. And then they started to demand it, from their employers as well, which is like, why do I have to wait until you're available and get through a 1-800 call center, or even physically go to sit with an HR person in order to initiate a leave of absence, right? Or whatever else it is that you need to deal with as a worker. And so then the shift came in, and it was like, well, I want the ability, I want the technology, I want the empowerment to do that on my own. And most organizations haven't even caught up with that trend, right? At least not in a good way, right? They may have offered something, but it's not a good experience. So now this new thing's coming along, and this idea that we have assistants in our personal lives that we can use for all sorts of things. And now I want that in the workplace too, to make my work easier, my life easier at work. And I think organizations are going to be unprepared for how quickly that shift is going to come, especially on the heels of ChatGPT, just to bring it around to the start of our conversation. Like, because now everybody knows.
Yeah.
Everybody knows the technology is there.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a lot of folks out there in the conversational AI space have decided to kind of focus on customer service, and I think it's just that's where all the money is.
Yeah. It's a bigger business case for sure.
Yeah. So they're like, well, that's how we'll make more money. And then they're integrating with these sort of antiquated old customer service tools,
The
IVRs that
CRM. Yeah.
designed it in 1970 that hasn't changed much, and yeah, CRMs that replace SAP that are really the new SAP, to be replaced. Um, and yeah, I find it um, yeah, a kind of a challenging conversation to have to say, like how can you shift that thinking to say start internally? What's you know, what's the,
Yeah. I
the
think
best way to
the
start that
hardest,
conversation?
yeah, I honestly, the hardest challenge is you're dealing with two completely separate, distinct parts of an organization. So, and I think because the business case is so much more attractive on the customer side, it's easier to make the initial sell that, hey, this is a direction of travel that you're going to want to invest in. The business case and the return is there on the internal side, but it's harder to get to the top of the priority list, right? Because
Okay,
especially if you're an HR leader or an IT leader, the amount of things that you have to deal with now, like just like everyone else, it's overwhelming, right? Like, if you go back even 10, 15 years ago, your strategy probably could be summed up in 3 to 5 bullet points. Now it's like I've got 25, 30 different things I've got to juggle, and so how do you prioritize this in the context of everything else?
right.
I see that as a big challenge, and we don't see a lot of really good partnership across, right? So, if you're an HR leader or an IT leader and um, might be interested in conversational AI, one of the first things we recommend is go talk to whoever runs your customer facing operation and see what they're doing, right? Because
Yeah,
you're probably not the first leader to start this journey within your own four walls, and
uh,
I bet there's a lot of lessons to be learned, and possibly a lot of things that you can just extend, right? Like, you don't have to start from scratch.
right.
Take what's already been built elsewhere and reapply it in a different situation, a different scenario. So we're trying to kind of break down those silos a little bit with our clients and try to help them think across a bit
Yeah,
more. And that's one of the concepts we've come up with recently, is this idea of a digital workplace, right? Where it's, you're not building an HR assistant or an IT assistant, or a finance assistant. You're building a worker assistant. And it kind of goes back to what you mentioned earlier, Rob, this idea that, I think you said Unilever,
yeah,
that in the future, every employee, every worker is going to have their own intelligent digital assistant. We're kind of pushing the same thing, and we wrote an article kind of intended to be thought provoking around this idea of a digital doppelganger, where not
yeah.
only do you have that digital assistant, but you are responsible for training them. You are responsible for what they do. You're
Uh,
responsible for the outcomes. You have a responsibility and oversight over that doppelganger, but it's an extension of you, and it's one that you can deploy to go deal with stuff you don't want to deal with, stuff you don't have time to deal with, whatever the case may be. But it operates in your likeness, which I think is a way to bridge a bit of the gap that we have now between how humans perceive machines, intelligent machines.
yeah, and it's fascinating when you start like thinking the digital twin side. It
Mm.
again sounds very futuristic to people, but it really is a practical thing. And
Yep.
we spend a lot of time around, not only just, employee doppelgangers, but the company digital twin.
Right.
The joke is like they need somewhere to work, you know. And so having all your tickets and customers and uh, systems and employees and assets in a digital twin that's, looks a lot like a graph.
Yep.
And then having those digital twins sort of work, with an awareness and a context of what's happening in the company. And of course, then it gets, absolutely, really crazy when you think about these things talking to each other.
Hmm.
Um, it just gets, it
Yeah,
gets super
let's not
confusing.
lose the audience. Yeah, let's not lose the audience yet. We'll
Exactly.
get there. We'll get there eventually. Yeah,
Yeah.
we've got a few cycles to get through first. But yeah, I like the digital twin environment too, and just the idea of simulated environments in general, right? Because it goes back to this experimentation and running into the locked door. If you can do that in a simulated environment and learn before you do it in a real environment and kind of mitigate the fallout of any of the lessons learned or consequences that you may face, like, that seems to be the smarter, better approach. But I don't see a lot of organizations doing that outside of really big, technical engineering type of projects or IT type of projects.
Right.
But you could take the same concept and apply it to pretty much everything we deal with in the business world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
100%.
it feels like there might be a missed opportunity as well. Greg, you were mentioning that companies need to really be thinking long term about productivity models and what kind of roles will exist in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yep.
And if you're working on solutions internally with your workforce, they're involved in designing those solutions. They're like having firsthand experience with AI that not only helps make their jobs better, but it also starts conditioning them for a new kind of role that they might have in their company,
Yeah.
which is probably like managing bots or doing something involved with AI. So I mean, the best way to it involves getting intimate with technology, and conversational AI has shown us through ChatGPT, shown everyone
Yeah.
that it can actually be an ideal interface for getting a lot more out of technology for everyone.
Yeah. I think this idea that people will, that they'll have the job fixing the machines, that's kind of always silly to me. It was the invention of the home cappuccino machine, didn't create an army full of cappuccino repairmen, machine repairmen. But it did explode baristas.
It's funny to visualize. Yeah.
But it did explode the profession of baristas. Like, baristas before then were just called waiters and waitresses. And now they're baristas. So it's
Right.
super interesting. We're really good at inventing new jobs, aren't we? I mean,
Oh yeah. I'm not worried about that. I think that's a great example though of where, we built a technology, a machine that actually automates part of the work, part of the process, maybe arguably does a better job, right? You're not going to have as many inconsistencies, and it's always going to be a good output or good product. But then we sort of took that and said, okay, well, if we don't have to do this type of work anymore, what's the added value we can wrap around what the machine does to create an experience, right? And so, I think the cappuccino machine and baristas and the rise of, chain coffee shops are probably all linked together somewhere. And now you can't imagine going and getting coffee without interacting with a highly trained, highly educated barista that, knows how to work the machines, sure, but that's not really what you think of as their job. Like that's a means to an end. What you're really getting is an experience, right?
Yeah, and it's a manual machine. They're usually by choice.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's better that way, right?
Yeah. I think it's kind of a fascinating side to this whole thing of what job will we invent in the future? Will there be a waiter for each table instead of waiters having sections, right? Will it be one waiter per table? It kind of brings me to like another question, which is around it to suggest that we won't invent new jobs is almost to say that we're kind of reached the max limit of customer experience and employee experience, right? It's to say there isn't much more to be done there. It feels like there's a lot more. We can get a lot better at those areas, and isn't that where it's going to go? Or what are your thoughts on that?
No, so absolutely. First of all, I think there's a huge gap between customer experience and employee experience right now, right? Like if you in our consumer world, right, you want to go buy something online, that experience is pretty good. It's way better than what we had 10 years ago. Could it be better than what we have today? Sure. But you compare and contrast that with the typical employee experience. There's all kinds of research out there about the number of different communication channels. We talked about it a little bit earlier. The number of different applications that you have to toggle through in order to just get your job done. The number of different places you have to go to find information. I think the workforce as a macro term right now is more overwhelmed, more distracted, dealing with more cognitive load than ever before. Whereas I feel like on the customer side of things, we're at least trending in the right direction. I don't think we've made the shift from an employee experience perspective yet. I think things have actually gotten worse, and maybe they have to get worse before they get better. Going back to the falling on the face moment, right? But coming on the heels of the pandemic, and outside of our frontline workers, most of us working from home and doing all of our work through computer, laptop, mobile device. I think there's this epiphany that we all had coming out of it, like this could be so much easier, this could be so much better. And it kind of goes back to some of the shifts we've talked about. Like I think the expectation is rising that organizations address this issue, and a lot of them don't know where to begin or where to start, or they don't understand how conversational AI, as an example, could play a role in that. So that's this whole like digital workplace concept again. And there was actually a really good interview that was in the New York Times on Sunday about this digital workplace concept. I think it's kind of become mainstream.
Yeah.
But the article kind of had a bit of a negative view on it. It's like, yeah, we're talking about it, but things aren't getting better. Was kind of my words summary of it. But there was a really interesting point in there from the interview subject, and we could probably find who it was. I don't remember off the top of my head. Really well accomplished researcher in the space. He basically said the problem right now is the gap between what we know we need, what we know would be better, and our ability to actually use the technology that's available to us to create it. Right? It's not that the gap between what we want and what technology can do. It's the gap between what we want and our ability to use technology to get there. So it's really all on us. It's a human problem right now. It's not a technology problem, which I think is really fascinating when you think about all this, because most people surface level will look at it and go, AI is not ready, or they'll go, I can't trust it. And it's actually not the problem. The problem is how we architect, design, and deploy it in a way that actually gets us where we want to be.
Hmm. Yeah, it's our ability to think about it, and the lack of experience we have with it. And I think it kind of comes down to the technology is there, but the examples aren't there yet. I
Yep.
think once we start seeing those examples, once some leaders step up here and, bruised and and all, they're going to look pretty good.
Tape on their
Yeah,
noses.
Yep.
a little makeup and they're going to look pretty good out there because they really kind of carved a kind of a vision for everybody else
Yeah.
to follow. I think that, it's always what described as, bunch of, uh, you know, entities standing on the edge of, birds standing on the edge of the cliff. Which one's going to fly first,
Yeah. No, that's
Greg, do you see this as like a leadership driven moment here? I mean,
I think
how do you
so.
see, like ROs, how are their roles going to change, do you think, in
So
response to all this stuff?
yeah, I do think it's a leadership opportunity. I'll say that, right? Because we talked about the curiosity phase. We're kind of through that. We're into this experimentation phase, and we're starting to see some breakthroughs, right? Like I think one really interesting breakthrough is in the talent acquisition space. And I
Yeah.
think people are starting to realize that conversational AI is a great medium to attract candidates, right? People that don't work for you yet, but that you want to work for you. Being able to give them an assistant that they can interface with whenever they need to through whatever channel they want, like that's a breakthrough moment, and clients are starting to pay attention to it. We need more breakthrough moments to get us in fully out of the experiment phase and into the what I would call kind of like the adoption phase, right? But it is a leadership thing, and I think CHROs, we kind of talked about being an executive now is probably harder than it's ever been, just with the number of things you have to deal with, the overwhelmingness of it, the pressures, competing priorities. But for the CHRO, when I think about AI, it's really kind of a dual mission. Mission number one is you have an opportunity to be a role model by figuring out how to close that gap of where do I apply this to create value, um, so that your peers can look over and be like, well, we need what they have in HR, right? Like we like to try to make our clients the heroes of the story, right? And they like it too, usually. So it's like that's an opportunity for the CHRO to be a hero within their own organization, within their own ranks. So that's a focus area. The other focus area, though, is while you're figuring out how to become a role model in AI adoption, everyone else in your organization is experimenting too. And there are risks and issues that need to be managed around the use of AI. And I think HR actually has an opportunity to play that role across the enterprise of how do you safely adopt AI, and how do you manage the transition we talked about earlier as it starts to impact jobs, impact organizations, impact teams. So we talk a lot about like this idea of work re-architected, which is, let's say someone in supply chain is introducing robotics into your warehouse, and it's now starting to do work that people used to do. You know, there's a knock-on effect there for the people that used to work in that facility that needs to be addressed. And I think HR is in a good position to help address that. It's a bit change management, but it's more than that. It's also, your job has changed. You no longer have to do this, and you now have the opportunity to do this, right? But we're not always thoughtful about that. We kind of throw technology into the mix, into the situation, and expect everything else to sort its way out. So I think that's a big part of it as well. It's just managing the transition. I think HR can play a lead role in that. And then again, the trustworthy, ethical, responsible, maybe is the best word, adoption of AI in different parts of your organization so that it doesn't have a negative impact on your workforce or your customers. So it's a new capability for HR to possibly develop alongside their partners in IT and other areas.
Yeah, I have this prediction, with fast adoption and quick disruption as we're seeing again, Google. I believe, and I don't know if it's a year from now or 2 years from now or 6 months from now, but the hockey stick, we're going to see these adopters, we're going to see these examples, and then there's going to be a lot of companies scrambling to find those people, as you said, like this is a people problem, not a technology problem. So everyone's going to realize the technology's there, and so that's not the scarcity, and they're going to try to find the people who know what they're doing here, and they're obviously going to come to, the organizations like yours, to speed that up, right? How will you guys handle? I mean, again, it's not quite there, and now you can scoop them up, but in short order, how do you think orgs like yours will handle this like crazy demand?
Yeah. It's interesting because we've dealt with this problem for years in different cycles, right? Every time something new comes along, something old tends to go away.
Yeah, right.
And if you're really good at reskilling and redeploying people that are, that have, skills that are no longer in demand, and you can sort of get them into a place where they can help in growing areas, that's one of the things that I think Deloitte does pretty well. There's always room for improvement, but that I think a lot of our clients don't do that well, right? We're in the business of people inherently, right? Like we make money off of selling people to our clients that have an expertise or a skill set. So there's no way that we can operate without that kind of reskilling, redeployment capability. But a lot of our clients don't need that as much, right? I mean, they may still be in a business where they rely heavily on skills. I think they're starting to realize that more and more, but they haven't had the same. It hasn't been as direct of a connection to the heart of the business, and it's becoming more of a direct connection now. So I think a lot of organizations are focused on this concept of moving toward more of a skill-based way of thinking about and managing their workforce, and that will be a step toward, I think, having that agility, Rob, that you're describing, of like something new comes along, and now I'm scrambling to find the talent that can help me keep pace with the hockey stick effect, and they're nowhere to be found. So if you can't find them, you've got to search to alternative ways to create that or fill that gap. So it could be finding a partner like Deloitte. It could be developing a new internal capability. It could be looking to international markets that maybe are under tapped. There's a lot of different levers that you can pull, but it's absolutely going to become a human problem, or continue to be a human problem as the uptick happens and we start to see scale.
Yeah, at least the barrier of convincing people to face plant will be gone.
Yeah.
They'll be lining up to do it, and now we have a mattress that you can face forward on.
Old problems gone, new problems emerge. Yeah, that's why we've been in business since 1845.
Yeah, I guess it's just staying ahead of them. You don't have to be at the destination. You just gotta, be able to lead them, in a direction. So, yeah,
right. Well, it seems like HR could play an integral role in really making sure that, as you were describing earlier, Greg, like AI gets deployed in the right way, and that people aren't short-sighted. People are thinking through
The impact. Yeah.
solutions. Yeah, because I think that's the kind of thing that HR departments tend to be attuned to. Am I right? Like I think.
Yeah. I think the big challenge there is going to be getting invited to the party. So it's twofold. It's getting invited to the party, but also having the actual capability to show up once you're there. Because I think as we move out of this experimentation phase into this mass adoption phase, scaling phase, it's going to be hard to keep track of all the little use cases and microservices and different things. And when you look at them individually, case by case, the impact may not seem that big. But as this is happening everywhere across your organization, there's a cumulative effect that's starting to build up. And it's sort of finding the right balance between being involved in every individual use case and the adoption of every individual solution, while also keeping an eye toward like what's happening at the macro level. That the cumulative effect of all of this adoption that's going to have the bigger impact, right? So you're eventually going to get to a place where machines are integrated into the way your business runs and pretty much every function, every department, every business line. And if you haven't managed the people side of the transition along the way, you're going to end up with um, this gap between what people are doing in the workplace and what machines are doing in the workplace, and it's going to be really hard to reconcile if you don't kind of figure it out along the way. You can't wait till you get to the end. We know there is no end, but kind of the proverbial end. You can't wait till you get to the proverbial end and look back and be like, oh well, what are we going to do with all these people? That's going to be unnecessary pain that we could avoid by building it into the strategy and the approach now.
And you mentioned. Oh, go ahead, Rob.
Oh, no, I was just going to say I think there's also a really high likelihood that, things like generative AI, chat, we're going to see a lot of these, right? I always say OpenAI convinced Microsoft to give them $1 billion to see if there was enough data on the internet to train a model to be useful.
I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in those meetings, by the way. I can only imagine.
You pull that off. And it turns out there is, and so the next model, Lambda, all these other, sort of followers on, Amazon's going to have to do something, IBM's going to have to answer. It's not as risky for them, right? They now know there's enough internet data to make these useful. And so, freeing up that capital isn't going to be nearly as difficult as the first one. So we're going to see a lot of these models popping out on there all around us, right? That will, just kind of make this more available, almost commoditize it in a way.
I was going to use the word, It's a race to the bottom, right? And the question in my mind is going to be, what's the reward for early adopters? Obviously, you get the advantage of being there first and getting the brand recognition and the market share that your competitors are going to start to erode into. But I'm talking more on the organization side, customer side of things, right? So, the question, and I'll ask you, Rob, maybe your thoughts is what's the advantage to an organization right now to adopt this before it's commoditized, right? And be a part of that early adoption part of the cycle, I guess.
Yeah. I think it comes back to what you said. You're investing in the humans in your company and their ability to learn this, and you're acknowledging that when you need it, those people won't be gettable,
Yeah.
And so in a way, it's not about the machines. It's about, getting that organizational muscle in place as quickly as possible so that when this is a must do, when this is a do or die situation, you're
not scrambling.
Yeah, you're not scrambling for resources that don't exist. Because it takes a lot to put your head into this. I don't know how long we've been talking for a while. With you guys on this, you've been deep into it for I don't know how long, and
4 years maybe.
Yeah, and how many people out there can say that? Not enough. That's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and people are going to think we scripted that. We really didn't. But yeah, that's like that's exactly what I would have said to the answer is it's you either act fast now and you have the luxury of being ahead of the curve, and you'll still have challenges, right? But they're different problems than if you wait and try to catch up later. And I think we've seen this play out with other, cycles and other technology innovations, right? It's the Netflix Blockbuster thing, right? Like, Blockbuster got into streaming toward the end, but it was too late at that point, right? You missed out on the content, you missed out on the talent. So, I think there's all kinds of other examples we could point to, but it's the same concept here, right? It's get ahead of it, act now, or run the risk of becoming obsolete without it if you can't catch up later.
Yeah, yeah, you're
Well, and how big a risk do you think this technology is to big companies? Because I mean, we've seen like we reference Lemonade, the insurance company, a lot in the book, because they're a tech first company that I think the way they say it is they're tech first. They happen to sell insurance across industries. That there's so much opportunity now for smart tech first companies to come in and kind of take over
Yeah.
as these lumbering existing giants try and acclimate. Like, is that something that's in the minds of enterprise right now? Do you think?
I think so, and that's the ideal of digital transformation. So it's much bigger than just hyper automation and conversational AI. It's really how do I become a technology first organization. And we've been working with the big dinosaurs, if you will, for a while to try to get there. The one thing that I would say to just sort of balance that out a little bit is not to underestimate what those big dinosaurs do really well, right? That some of the new entrants um, have trouble figuring out later on, and I think we've seen this play out over and over again too. It's how to operate a successful publicly traded company, how to have the right operational governance and metrics. So all these things that cause them to move slower from an outside in perspective are also potential sources of value, right? And advantages when you think about, the muscles. I'll use your word, Rob. That these newer entrants are going to have to grow, even though they're led tech first. They still have to figure those things out too. So it's, every organization is dealing with a different set of problems, and they're always trying to close gaps to help them get from where they are to where they want to be. The gaps are just different. So, the big older companies are absolutely on that digital transformation journey. There's definitely things that we could be doing to accelerate that. Some of them are doing it better than others. But on the flip side, right, the newer entrants to the market that are tech first, they're on their own journey, right? And a lot of them are going to look for IPOs and different things in the future. And just having really good technology and technology at your core by itself is not going to help them get where they want to be. So I think every organization's on a journey. The journey just looks a little bit different based on where you're at and where you're trying to go.
It's an excellent point. Well, and that digital transformation. I mean, we were talking briefly about experience design earlier. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it kind of started 10 years ago or more with experience design,
Mhm.
right? And like kind of the same conversations. Like, we need UX. What the hell is UX? And then the people who figured out what it is are either too scared to move, or they go all in and fall on their faces
Yep.
and are looking better for it now.
Yeah, the new one's product, right? I feel like we went from UX specialist to now product specialist, which
Definitely.
the best I can define it is we took a bunch of other disciplines and we tried to throw them all together into this new multidisciplinary capability. And I see a huge gap with a lot of organizations where they'll define this role, but there's no people that can actually do all those things. They can't fill that role, and they're moving people into it that have, like, let's say, one or more of those disciplines in their background, like project management, UX, whatever, and just hoping that they can figure out the rest, right? So we're actually doing a lot of work right now with companies trying to help them uh, embed a product mentality and capability and an approach, and actually close the skill gap to get there, right? Because you can't just create a job and put a person in that role and expect that they're going to be able to do all these different things. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, the ever recurring hunt for the unicorn.
Yeah, exactly. And the pendulum swings too between like highly specialized people versus generalist, multidisciplinary, can do it all, and it'll keep swinging kind of back and forth, I think.
Yeah, and it was interesting too because your digital doppelganger report that came out, it came out kind of before ChatGPT,
Yes, like,
as did our book.
yep, like right
Um,
before.
but yeah,
Yeah.
but the ideal of a digital doppelganger dovetails so wonderfully with ChatGPT in a way. I mean, um, I think people are now seeing how that might look in their lives just from having ChatGPT write emails for them. I
Mhm.
think their minds are starting to churn like, oh, technology could do all sorts of things for me. So while companies are certainly wise probably to look at digital twin organizations and digital twins for workers, do you think they're thinking about the fact that consumers are also probably on that path towards establishing their own digital twins, and that at some point it's going to be like digital twins talking to digital twins? There's going to be that barrier, perhaps.
Maybe. I think in our personal lives, it's already started to look different, right? Because uh, we first got exposure to this through an assistant on our phone or a physical device that we have in our homes, right? The whole smart home concept. And the idea that you train that assistant based on your preferences, you can, choose what music service you want to listen to. You can create um, what we would think of in our world as kind of like workflows or microservices to, turn the lights on when you walk in or set the temperature at a certain point in time. Like all of my lights are on a pattern, right? Like that's what I was thinking of when we started the digital doppelganger concept, is the idea that that same level of personalization that I can create through an assistant in my home, or on my mobile device, my smart device, I could have at work too, right? Like the technology is there. I just have to invest the same way I've trained and set up and configured all of my smart home devices. I could do the same thing with the same type of technology at work, and maybe even beyond, right? And its ability to integrate with other technologies and work with other assistants. Like my device can communicate with the assistant on my home speaker system and play music in my house. Like so, that's the imagination side of it that I have, is like the same kind of idea of a smart home I want in a smart workplace.
Mhm.
And if my workplace is primarily from home and I'm doing all of this on my laptop or desktop or whatever, then that smart assistant is basically living in a digital workplace, right? And has to have the ability to work across all those applications and workflows and different things that I would normally have to deal with on my own. Now I can get an assistant to go and do it and execute on my behalf.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the challenge for a lot of people, especially if you're not looking at the tech, like, might be your wife or your mom or whatever that says, "Oh, great, $1,000 light switch. Thanks a lot. That was
Yeah. Yep.
like and but like understanding that what you've created is a baseline for automation. You're not done. You've
Yeah.
educated yourself through that. You've started thinking through, you know, how to think about this tech, and that you've created an underlying automation platform to go way further than just light switches.
Right.
But that is the challenge, right? Like, he's not wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. And the $1,000 light switch, right? That's the cost of the early adopter, I guess. It's because it's a lot it's a lot cheaper now. But and I didn't put together a business case around how
Right.
much time would I save by not having to worry about turning lights on and off. But that's really that's the conversation we're having with clients, right? So when they talk about using conversational AI to, let's say, manage a new hire through the onboarding experience, which is a multi-touch interaction. It can take place over the span of, you know, weeks and months to get through the full kind of experience. It's compliance related activity, so it's in many cases a must do, but it's also kind of on the value added side, right? Like how quickly can I get this person productive in their new role? How much of a relationship can I form between them and their peers and their network, help them create a network? How much of a bond can I create between them and their employer, the workplace, and create that engagement? So there's a lot of different components, and the value case or the business case behind automating that, it's not just about how fewer light switches do I have to flick, right?
Yeah.
Because this assistant's in place. It's about creating an experience for a new hire that would be almost impossible to replicate with humans, right?
Right.
Because you can't
Better than
afford, the
human.
business. Yeah, you almost look at the reverse business case, like design your ideal onboarding experience, and then go figure out how much it would cost to have humans provide that
Right.
level of concierge service, and it would be astronomical. No one would ever go for that, right? It's just not practical. But then if you come behind it and say, well, what if I could offer you an assistant that could do it for X number of dollars? Now all of a sudden you're kind of flipping. It's not about it's comparing and contrasting two different approaches
Right.
versus trying to create an ROI driven business case, which there's nothing wrong with that. And obviously we live in a world where we have to be careful with resources and
Uh-huh.
and we have to be financially um, responsible, but we've kind of tried to get out of the hard dollars and cents of a business case and talk more about the art of the possible and why this is a good investment, even if you can't clearly show
Right.
that you're going to recover the dollar investment through time savings, right? That equation's um, doesn't work in every situation.
Yeah, you said earlier cognitive load, and I think it's pretty relevant here. Uh, in terms of thinking about ROI. Um, I read an article. I think it's almost common knowledge at this point, but like Barack Obama, gray suit, blue suit, and
Hmm.
and the whole point was to just he had to make so many decisions.
Simplify.
Yeah, simplify in a day. So he wanted to save his cognitive load, right? Because he's like thinking, there's only so many decisions I can make in a day. I don't want to waste it on which suit to wear. And so when we think about machines doing some of those mundane tasks and we measure the value of those tasks, we're not measuring the freed cognitive load, right, for your
Yeah.
employees and then what they do with that creative thinking, right? It's not the choice of and the cost of the choice of, the what to wear. It's
Right.
it's where did Barack Obama then spend his time? What decision did he make better that day? Um, and then what was the ROI of that decision?
Right.
Super hard to track, but he did it right. He did at the highest level. So I think it's fair to say that the rewards are there, even if you can't measure them. And maybe we get a little too caught up on what we can measure.
I think that's absolutely the case, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier of this productivity focus and short-term incentive focus. Like we're just not good at sort of breaking down those norms and being like, does it even make sense to take our old way of thinking about technology investment and hard dollar business cases and ROIs and apply it to this new type of technology that can do new things? It's going to take some time for us to get through that whole shift because it touches so many parts of an organization, so many different parts of the business that have to kind of come together and agree, like, or the world just moves into a big paradigm shift. But for everyone to come together and say, yep, you know what, we need to think about this differently and do this differently, that's going to take some time. But I'm optimistic, and I'll do a quick plug for Deloitte's 2023 Human Capital Trends Report. It's our you know one of our biggest pieces of evidence that we put out every year, but there's a chapter in there that's all about powering human impact with technology.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest points that we try to make is exactly what you just described, that if all you're thinking about is technology investment from an ROI and a headcount efficiency, productivity efficiency perspective, you are going to significantly limit yourself in this next wave of technology adoption.
Yeah, it's like an over focus on what you can measure, and
Yeah,
and you go, well, that leads to bringing your founders back at Google, right?
yeah,
it,
exactly, right. You got to try something new.
yeah, like did OpenAI know that when they got into this, they were gonna eventually sell ChatGPT at $20 a head? No way, right?
Yeah. Like I said, I wish I could have been a part of those conversations. And I have to say quickly, I know exactly what you're talking about with the Obama reference. And I was really proud of myself because I used to travel every week for client work, was on the road Monday through Thursday. And about 10, maybe 12 years ago, I realized how cognitively taxing packing my suitcase every week was on Sunday nights. And I'm like, you don't want to be thinking about that on Sunday nights. So I did the exact same thing. I completely simplified my wardrobe and basically had like 4 suitcases worth of clothing. And so it became this thing that I didn't even have to think about. Like it just was Monday morning, 5 a.m., heading to the airport, and I would just grab a chunk of things and drop them in a suitcase, and I was done. And I wish I wish I could articulate the benefit or value of that in a way that would make sense to people, because it was an investment for me to do that. But the relief that I felt not having to worry about this on Sunday nights, and the level of stress reduced on Sundays and Mondays for me, and the focus I could divert to my clients and to my work and to whatever else had going on, was not only not measurable, but probably invaluable to me. I did it way before Obama, so that's kind of cool.
Well, it's interesting too, because just like the productivity model that we've been talking about, it almost seems to regard humans as machines, right? It's like, here, do this repetitive task until your body and mind completely reject it and you can't do it anymore, and then we'll give you, your gold watch,
and you can retire,
and you can go watch the sunset. Yeah, but it seems like now,
anymore.
Yeah. But now we have an opportunity to let machines take that burden, and now people can make better use of their time, which is what you're describing, Greg. Like,
it's a scary frontier.
Smart implementation to free up your time is It is scary.
It's a scary frontier.
That much time. What are we going to do with it?
We talked about it earlier. We always find a way, right? The barista will emerge. But the transition is the hard part, right? When you look at a single machine and a single new job that may come out of it, and a single use case, single application, it's easy to manage. But when you're dealing with this across an enterprise, across an organization, and we work with clients that have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of employees, being able to even understand and get your head around the problem and what disruptions are happening is really hard. We've seen a lot of clients that have started to invest in like listening tools and sentiment analysis tools and things that use AI to get a better pulse on the workforce. But it still feels reactive to me. It's slightly more proactive, because you're not waiting until somebody knocks on your door and says, I don't like this change. But it's still reactive in the sense that we're picking up all that data after the change has already occurred, and then we're going out and trying to do something about it. For me, the better approach is, we get tied in on the front end of, here are technology investments we're making, here are AI use cases we're experimenting with or deploying, and having a human lens to it to identify what is the impact of this on the workforce, on the people who used to do this job, on the organization as a whole, and figuring out ways to kind of manage through that. And it can be, we talked about rescaling and redeploying. That's definitely a big opportunity. We talked about the idea of incentivizing people to work in new ways and to behave differently, right? Like breaking the mold of not thinking of myself from a productivity lens and not viewing my value from a productivity lens. That doesn't work if I'm the only one who makes that shift. I need everyone around me to be a part of that shift. It's a cultural shift. So there's a lot of work to be done, I think, to get there. I'm not worried about our human ingenuity in terms of creating that next job. What I'm worried about is not worried, but what I think we'll need to focus on for the next couple of years is, how do we minimize collateral damage, manage through the transition, and actually focus on the human side of this, not the technology side of this. Because if we don't, I don't think we're actually going to get the value from the technology investment, whether it's measurable or not. I think people have to come along in the journey.
Yeah, it makes sense. It sort of seems like, the companies who can get their employees to embrace change are the ones that will thrive in this environment. Adoption of the technology is more of a methodology. It's making them familiar with it so they're less afraid of it and can start playing with it. But at the end of the day, it's still a human problem to get them to embrace that change and to start thinking of creative ways to apply it. It also seems like I agree with you. The internal first, start, you know, start
Yeah.
internal. It seems like there's an issue there, siloed, as you pointed out, where it's almost like all business units should just throw in the pot, you know, so that HR can get these tools, or who should this belong to, really?
Yeah.
Should the head of marketing go get, con, talk to, talk to you guys about getting the tool for their employees, or is that, is that stepping on toes? Like,
Yeah.
how would somebody who's like watching this going, well, I'm not HR, how do I get these tools for my employees and start that way?
Yeah. I have a feeling there's a lot of people from HR that are watching this and going, well, we're not doing any of this yet, and I don't know where to begin. So,
The money,
or
because they
maybe,
won't give it to me.
yeah, right. And I have zero budget, and if I did have any budget available, I've got 100 other problems I have to solve for.
Right.
Right. It goes back to the must do versus nice to have, and I don't think people have quite put this in the category of must do yet. We're getting closer and closer to that, but there's a couple things. So I have seen clients start to solve for this structurally by creating a digital experience function
Good.
that reports right up to the COO or the CEO
Yeah,
and
Gartner
has
is really pushing
responsibility.
this right now. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's a trend. It's emerging, but we're actually seeing it in practice too. And the one kind of challenge that I've seen with that, and I think we see this with any new function that emerges all the way up to the C-suite level. It's getting your charter right, figuring out strategy roadmap linked to everyone else's strategy and roadmaps, and then actually having the funding and
Yeah.
capability to do something. I think a lot of organizations feel like we'll create the role, create the function, and it's just going to sort of magically work itself
Bad
out.
tech box. Yeah.
Yeah, or it's a coordination role. It's like my
Right.
job is to coordinate all these other functions to do the right thing from a digital
Right.
experience perspective, and that's I think a recipe
Yeah.
for, I won't say failure because
No.
somebody will figure it out, but it's a recipe for challenge.
Yeah, it's
For
the whole,
sure.
I bought the gym membership and I bought the book on dieting and exercise. I'm not
Why
going
am
to
I
the
not losing
gym,
weight?
and I'm
Yeah,
not why am I not losing weight?
yeah, I can't figure it out. I did all the right things. So that's an emerging trend, the kind of structural creation of this new role, this new focus. But I think where that's not the case, what I've seen HR do well when they really kind of want to take this on is they're vocal about it. They make it
Yeah.
their strategy. They start to prioritize things differently, right? So I have a client that has uh, anchored their HR strategy around only four things.
Yeah.
Digital experience is one of those four things. And when they go into their um, budget planning funding cycle every year, if the investment they're making doesn't support an improvement in digital experience, then it falls below the line, right? It's sort
Uh-huh.
of putting your money where your mouth is a little
Right.
bit,
Right.
right? But you start by saying this is what we're going to do, being really intentional about it, making it the priority. But then you actually have to follow through on that. So when you're faced with a tough choice of I can use dollars to make this easier for employees, or I can fix this plumbing issue that
Right.
creates a lot of work for my HR team.
Yeah.
You got to make sure you have to have the incentive there to do the digital experience investment, even though to all of our points earlier, it may not have a quantifiable, measurable return. Whereas if I fix the plumbing issue and I could get my HR team out of all this like firefighting data fixing, I could write a hard dollar business case against that, right?
Right.
Like it's actually eliminating manual work within a concentrated team. So we're starting to see those little micro shifts and breaking the mold of let's do things because it's strategically the right thing to do based on where we want to go
Okay.
versus the thing that's going to carve out savings or create efficiencies in the short
Right.
term.
One of the things I see is companies kind of wanting to get a small win under their belt. Like, let's get a small win, kind of, and then maybe that'll convince people, and then we'll free up more budget and get another bigger win. And it sounds logical, on the face of it. But then I sort of ask, being the scientist I am, I'm always like, great. So you get a small win and it fails, then what? No AI? That's it. It wasn't for us. So you kind of
Yeah.
ask yourself, are you really almost, um, going slow now on purpose and dooming your success by thinking you're mitigating um, the risk by you looking for these small wins and then building upon them. What's
Right.
your thoughts
Uh,
there?
yeah. I mean, I'm a big fan of the scientific approach. I'm not a scientist by trade like you are, but um, I think it comes in handy in the business world more often than not, which is instead of thinking about it as I'm going to experiment for the sake of experimenting. We talked about that earlier too.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to experiment with a hypothesis in mind. And
There.
my goal is and this is actually part of our human capital trends report as well. This idea that people need to think more like researchers, right? I'm trying to solve a problem. And the way that I'm going to solve a problem, maybe you choose to use the scientific method, is I'm going to create a hypothesis and I'm going to test that hypothesis. And if you test the hypothesis and it turns out to not be true, a good scientist or researcher doesn't just quit there. They go, well, maybe my hypothesis was wrong, or
Right.
maybe I tested it the wrong way. But you don't. The journey doesn't end there. You change your hypothesis and you test again. But usually, that only works if you're anchored to solving a problem. And the good news is there's no shortage of problems out there. I think the researcher though, the researcher mentality says, I'm going to hone in on a very specific problem. I'm going to define what solving that problem means, right? I'm going to talk about how I would measure to ensure that problem's been solved, not over measuring, but like it could be just that workers feel more productive, right?
Okay.
It doesn't have to be a hard dollar type of measurement. Um, and then I'm going to build these hypotheses that say if I do this, this, and this, multi-factored experimentation. If I do this, this, and this, then these things will become true.
Yeah.
And then you experiment, and sometimes you're right, and you're going down the right path. Sometimes you're wrong, and you need to make an adjustment. But I think that's the mentality we need to have.
Yeah.
It's not experiment, fail, and quit.
Right.
It's experiment, adjust, and experiment again.
Yeah. It almost seems like this has to come at the board level, where they just, that you gotta spend X amount of your budget on exploring this stuff, and almost pushing an organization toward, thinking of it as like, sort of that team, where to deploy this capital, what projects to try, and then reporting back,
Right.
What are you getting for this versus the bottom up where the team has to justify to the board why and what the outcome will be and what the ROI is. It feels like once that shift happens, like, like we're seeing at Google and stuff, then we'll start to see that, that taking away that fear of failure that is required in experimentation. You can't, you can't mix two chemicals together and say, oh crap, it didn't cure cancer. And then,
Right.
and
Let's
then
stop
throw a
trying to cure
pity
cancer.
party, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's exactly it, and it sort of goes back to what I thought. I referenced a client that I thought they did really well, right? So CHRO saw the problem, saw the opportunity. The digital experience wasn't great. Said, I'm going to be intentional about this, and then as they take their strategy up to the C-suite, rest of the C-suite, the board, and they say, we are going to address digital experience. It's a multi-year plan. But I think it gives executives permission, with or without, the board has to sign off on the strategy, right? But
Right.
when you get down to the actual execution of the strategy, I think it gives people more permission or flexibility to make investments that they otherwise couldn't,
Uh-huh.
right? Because it's anchored to a strategy that's bold and innovative and trying to move the organization in a new direction. So if you have an HR strategy today that is, I'm going to implement this software, or I'm going to focus on reducing retention, reducing turnover this year. Those things are important. They might be helpful, but I think you're kind of anchoring to the wrong things. You want to anchor to something that's more outcome driven, that you can then use as a way to make decisions and investments along the way.
Right.
And the digital transformation idea is interesting too, because an organization, by virtue of going through this process, of accepting failure as a first step and all that, they're going to come out the other side transformed. They're not going to be the same organization, and that could probably run pretty deep, depending on how far they take this journey.
Yeah, we often lose sight of that, right? Like how much we change just by going through a transformation, and the uncaptured value behind that, right? Just going through a digital transformation, people learn new things. They embrace agile in a way that you can't embrace just by reading the playbook, right? You actually live it and breathe it, and it becomes sort of part of your DNA as a professional. So I think it's a really interesting point, and we don't always really talk about that kind of ancillary benefit of trying and experimenting and adjusting and experimenting again, and the effect that can have on individuals that, when added up, can really help to drive cultural shift. And we talked about it a little bit earlier, this idea of the big traditional dinosaur enterprise companies. They all want to become more agile. That was a universal trend a couple of years ago, and I think they're all still on that journey, moving at different speeds. But we see it all the time where someone will say, "Yeah, we're agile because we trained everybody in our IT department on this agile program," and then you go look at how they're actually executing projects, and it's all traditional waterfall, and there's no actual appetite or forgiveness for experimentation and failure. It's all kind of talk, no walk. And the one thing I worry about with sort of the economic cycle and inflation and kind of looking at a potential global recession, at least some headwinds, right, is organizations that have been investing in this agile journey are very quick to be like, all right, scrap it, we got to save money, right? And it goes back to that short-term incentive problem. And we'll get on the other side of this, as we always do, and they're going to have to start over again. And that's one of the biggest reasons that I think some of these bigger traditional enterprises haven't been able to navigate the change.
Yeah, it's almost like the companies that thrive in a recession will have the competitive advantage just based on timing, and
100%.
And that'll be interesting as we look in the rearview mirror at how much the timing mattered in all of this.
Yeah.
And there's like a human element too. For people on an individual level, change registers as trauma, even if it's positive change. The first part of it is trauma, and I think that's true for organizations as well. And that's something that most people aren't comfortable acknowledging about themselves. So we can't expect enterprises to be great at it either.
Yeah, we do a lot of generating code with generative AI internally.
Sure.
And you'll hear a lot within our walls of it's too, you have to be more agile than agile. Like agile is not agile enough for one-time use code generation. I liken it to creating a spreadsheet. Are we going to have a Scrum meeting? Are we going to create an epic? No, just build the spreadsheet. I could have been done by the time the meeting was over, right? And we're seeing that code getting created for one-time use going so quick that it's too agile for agile, and that there's before
over agile.
Before they've even adopted agile, we realize that there needs to be a new too agile for agile process.
Well, and it's a great example of where human nature kind of ruined agile, right? Because the original idea behind it was 4 basic principles and this new way of thinking. It's reduce documentation, be okay with experimentation and failure, and we took that and we said, all right, well, let's build a bunch of big products around it, and agile training and ceremonies and tools, basically, right? Tools and all these different things. And then, when organizations come around and they're like, well, we want to become agile, we sell them all these big bulky things, or, give them all these big bulky things that are actually maybe anti-agile.
Right. The software is how operates agile. So in order to change your process, now you got to change the software. It's like
you
lost yourself.
It's a never-ending cycle. Yeah, never-ending cycle. It's funny.
Yeah. The more things change, the more they stay the same. I feel like the good news here, though, is that, AI obviously is inevitable, but we need more people.
Oh, yeah. It's a people problem. I go back to, and I have this conversation with clients all the time right now. It's not a gap between what you want, and we do all these like design thinking journey maps. We talked about designing the ideal onboarding experience, and we try to do that separate from technology, right? Forget technology, forget what vendors and products you already have. Like let's just abandon that for a moment. Let's talk about what people need, when they need it, how they want it, um, and put that on paper, and that becomes sort of your north star, right? That's what you want to try to achieve, and then you work backwards to what technology can do. And there's this moment where people inevitably realize that the technology they have today is never going to create the experience that they want, their ideal experience. But then you educate and you say, well, these are the types of tools that are available out there that you can bring in and help you close the gap, right? You may not get all the way there, and you're not going to get all the way there in one big waterfall program. You're going to have to, get there in an agile way, building and experimenting, failing and adjusting and experimenting again. Um, and 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 the conversation just kind of falls there, right? Because that gap between the technology they're comfortable with and the experience they want to create, even if they know the technology is there to fill that gap, it becomes the problem we talked about earlier of humans not knowing how to apply it and architect it and close the gap. So
Yeah.
I think it's entirely a human issue at this point, and it's our imagination, it's our ability to think differently, architect things that don't exist today. That's the type of stuff that we need to be promoting to close that gap.
Yeah, you could almost say it's, starts at budgeting and, this waterfall, beginning at budgeting ends up transcending all the way down the pipe. The second,
It carries through.
yeah, the second you said we've allocated this many dollars for this project and the ROI is this and the outcome is this, you've already boxed everybody in to creating an estimate on how long it's going to take to do that thing and then a design because you can't estimate without a design and that we're just stuck and
Yeah.
so yeah, makes sense.
When we've talked about a productivity model kind of treating people like machines, but now we really are at a moment where we need people to be human. We need the human abilities to help coach this technology forward.
Yeah,
So,
and it's not to
design
say that productivity isn't important and that outcomes aren't important.
no.
I think that's what gets lost in the messaging sometimes. We think about it as either or. This is about creating a
Mhm.
better balance between the two, right? Especially while we're in this transition period of AI adoption. It's you know especially helping leadership and stakeholders, shareholders, like we're getting all the way to kind of the end, at least for publicly traded companies. It's it's respecting the productivity needs and demands there while also creating capacity to think differently, do things differently. And I think we'll start to see the balance shift more and more over time. But just even creating the opening for us to, 20% of our time should 30% of our time should be spent on this idea of human uh, elements that we can bring to the workplace to make it a better workplace, or to our customers to make it a better customer experience. Most workers don't have that luxury, right? They are task driven and productivity driven, and we've got to start to create that room for them to do things differently.
Yeah, the optimist to me wants to say that, if you ever look at a GPT written, paragraph or story, it's pretty generic. It's usually, yes, it passes,
Yep.
but it, you know, I want to say that it's just going to up our game as creative humans to say, generic and basic isn't going to work anymore.
No.
You're going to have to really push the boundaries of your creativity. You're going to have to spend a little bit more time on it, thinking through how to come up with a new angle, and just regurgitating, other people's words and mixing them up a little bit as GPT does. That's all a lot of us were doing, and that's not going to cut it anymore. You're going to have to
Right.
be more creative. It's going to push us to think more creatively and ideally give us the time to be more creative. So maybe it just makes us all better.
So that reminds me of this story that I heard about, and I read an article on, but I may get some of the details wrong. But there was an artist who won an art competition using AI generated art. And there was a lot of
Yeah.
controversy from the other artists saying, like, this is cheating, or at a minimum should be in a separate competition. But then when you actually learned about what the artist did, he spent over 40 hours trying different inputs and massaging and manipulating what he was feeding to the AI generative tool. And you start to wonder, well, how is that different, right? Like it's not a paintbrush, but there's still art involved. There's still humanity involved. It's just involved in the input side of the equation. It doesn't have to be involved in the throughput part. So I think, kind of to your point, Rob, I think that's a really interesting example. And I love how all this is playing out in the art world first, because we always thought that that was the place that was the most sacred and safe from AI, and it's all happening there. It's in music, it's in painting, it's in all kinds of different forms of art, poetry, writing TV scripts and different things. But I think it's going to be that's the elevation. That's the barista moment, right? Of somebody realizing that I can make art in a different way using AI to augment my vision. But what I'm arguing whether what it created, what you jointly created together, is still art and worthy of being judged alongside art that was created in a traditional way. I think that's a great little microcosm example of what we're going to start to deal with in the workplace and just in general in society as this moves forward.
Yeah. Making money at art certainly is a question mark out there, and how that's going to change. But making art, that's not going to change. The experience of making art has nothing to do with whether machines can do it or not. So if you like making art and you like the experience of making art, whether it's alone or with other people, maybe we start focusing on that and not the outcome and how much money I can make off the art I created. And maybe more of us, our time are freed up to make art instead of, stamping license plates or whatever it is we're doing.
You're right. Right. Yeah. The one other thing I love about that story is it's a great example of how AI is going to test current norms and structures, right? So we've always looked at art competitions and evaluating art the same, well, not always, but for a long time, we've looked at it the same way. And now it's going to force us to think differently. And I don't know exactly how we're going to respond, but a response is needed, right?
Yeah.
We need to make a change somewhere. And it's, again, on the human side of the equation that change is going to be required.
Yeah. Well, I think there's an irony here in that conversational AI, the best place for orgs or people to go is to start having conversations with people who are a little further down the curve than them. That's probably where they need to start, right? Is listening or participating in having conversations about this, and then where to begin.
I think so, and I think there's something we can do too to kind of meet them in the middle. And that's one of the things that I really liked about ChatGPT is how we made the technology so accessible, easy to use, real. We made it real, right? And I'm using a very broad we. I had nothing to do with OpenAI's success with ChatGPT, but I think all of us that are kind of in this movement, if you want to think of it that way, have a responsibility to think of ways that we can kind of bring others along. And I think it's the tangible, real examples that people can touch, feel, interact with that are going to get them there.
Yeah, it's a really true statement that the large language model and the creation of that had happened long before ChatGPT. We were using it and implementing it, well over a year before ChatGPT came out. ChatGPT is really just putting a accessible face on it so that other people could play with what only we could, or very few of us could. And it's really amazing to see what impact it has when it's not the creation or invention of the technology that is the moment. It's the moment that it becomes accessible to a larger group of people. That's the breakthrough moment, and it usually comes, almost incidentally, as OpenAI is like, oh well, why don't we put a chat interface on this thing we already have. And throw it out there and see what happens. And to your point, it became the most successful app in the history of apps. I'm like, okay,
Yeah, broke the world a bit.
Yeah.
experiment.
And it was never what they set out to do, right?
Right.
Like, so that's the other funny part is it's experimenting and adjusting, and
Yeah.
man, you're going to eventually reach one of those breakthroughs, right?
Yeah. Well,
It's
hats
kind of
off
the
to
inevitability if you stick to it. Yeah.
hats off to Microsoft. I mean, they were brave. That was a lot of
Yes.
money. They really took a risk there.
Does require some bold
Yeah.
bold thinkers and some bold action
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that could be a good example though for companies moving forward. That was a somewhat fearless decision.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I feel like that we could probably talk for another hour, but that's probably a good place
Yeah.
to leave it for
Yeah.
now. I really like this idea that we've merged on though, that at the root of conversational AI is conversation, is more people talking about it and more people talking to different people and figuring out ways to kind of bring everyone into the fold. So
Yeah.
Greg, really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure.
Rob, you as well.
Yeah.
I told you it would
Yeah.
be the highlight of my day. I love talking about this stuff, and talking about it with other people that are really into it is absolutely my joy. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
What a treat. Thanks again for listening to Invisible Machines. We are produced in partnership with UX Magazine. Be sure to subscribe to UX Magazine wherever you get your podcasts to listen to new episodes. You can also watch us on the Invisible Machines YouTube channel. We'll be back next week with a discussion about AI and UX. That's pretty interesting. Rob and I get into some new territory talking about the roles, the important roles that designers will play in our future with technology. Mad props, as always, to the marketing team at OneReach AI, and thank you to Michael Litvinov, our video editor. We will be back next week with more Invisible Machines.